Welcome back, dear friend. I hope you came prepared, because today on Helpful Think we dive into a rather unusual video. 10 creepy historical facts you were never taught in school. Let's begin. Number 10. Slug Soup. In the 14th century, Guido da Vigevano, a doctor serving King Philip VI of France, discovered an unlikely antidote for aconite poisoning, a plant also known as monkshood, infamous for its lethal toxicity. Aconite was so deadly that it was reportedly weaponized by Muslims during the Crusades, posing a serious threat to anyone exposed to it. Aconitine, the primary toxic compound in aconite roots, wreaks havoc on the heart, muscles, and central nervous system, often leading to fatal cardiac damage. But how did a medieval doctor stumble upon a cure for such a deadly poison? Observing slugs devouring aconite leaves without suffering harm, Vigevano hypothesized that these creatures might hold the key to an antidote. Collecting the slugs, he boiled them into a broth, first testing it on animals before daring to try it on himself. To test his theory, Vigevano had to poison himself with aconitine, then drink his slug-based concoction. After vomiting 3 times, he reported that his health began to improve. His courage and unconventional approach, though unsettling, led to one of the more curious antidotes of the time, proving that even in the 14th century, ingenuity and bravery could make all the difference. Number 9. Bomb shadows. In 1945, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki left behind eerie shadows on sidewalks and buildings, shapes of bicycles, cars, and tragically, people. Survivors were horrified to discover that these imprints represented the final moments of those caught in the blast, reminiscent of Pompeii's victims preserved in volcanic ash. But how did these haunting images form? As Dr. Michael Hartshorn from the University of New Mexico School of Medicine explains, these shadows are more akin to photographs than typical shadows. When the atomic bomb detonated, an immense burst of heat and light radiated from the explosion, instantly bleaching everything in its path. Objects and people acted as shields, blocking the light and heat, and leaving the area behind them unscathed, while the surrounding surfaces were seared white. These darkened shadows were created by the contrast between bleached and shielded areas, capturing a chilling snapshot of that devastating moment. In a grim way, the atomic bomb acted like a monstrous camera, preserving its victims in the last instant of their lives. It's a haunting and tragic form of imagery, one that freezes an incomprehensible moment of destruction forever. Number 8. Animal trials. Throughout centuries in Europe, countries like Switzerland, France, and Italy conducted bizarre trials where animals were taken to court. These lawsuits, filed against creatures ranging from pigs to rats, stemmed from both secular and religious motives. Secular courts would prosecute individual animals, like a pig that attacked a person, while the clergy would accuse pests like locusts or rats of crimes such as stealing crops. Often, these pests were even excommunicated by the church. One such strange trial took place in 1457 in the Paris suburb of Savigny. A sow, along with her 6 piglets, violently assaulted a 5-year-old boy named Jehan Martin. The animals were caught red-handed, arrested, and imprisoned to await trial. The sow, deemed guilty, was sentenced to perish, but the piglets were acquitted because there was no proof they participated in the attack, even though they were drenched in blood. Strangely, the pig's owner faced only a charge of negligence and avoided further punishment. This unsettling and absurd chapter of history highlights how animals were once treated as legal offenders, judged and punished for their actions as if they were human criminals. It's a fascinating, albeit creepy, reminder of the oddities that have existed in the judicial systems of the past. Number 7. Pharaoh Pepe Neferkare, who ascended to the Egyptian throne at the age of 6 in 2278 BC during the 6th dynasty, led a long and eccentric reign. With his mother serving as his guardian, Pepe eventually became known for his unusual behaviors. One peculiar habit was his practice of ordering slaves to coat themselves in honey to keep flies away from him. While the act seems absurd, it highlights his deep loathing for the insects. Ironically, flies came to symbolize perseverance in Egyptian society due to their tenacity, and soldiers who showed exceptional valor were awarded golden fly medals, possibly marking the first use of an honorary medal in history. Pepe's strange habits extended beyond fly-related quirks. A letter discovered from his reign shows him ordering Harkhuf, the ruler of Aswan, to capture and bring him a dwarf from Nubia. This peculiar request adds to the mystique surrounding the pharaoh, whose reign is marked by a mix of oddities and grandeur. On a more historical note, Pharaoh Pepe II is often considered the longest reigning monarch in history. Some sources claim his rule spanned an impressive 94 years, while others suggest a shorter but still lengthy 64 years. Regardless, his reign, filled with eccentricities, remains one of the most intriguing in ancient history. Number 6. Syphilitic Zombies. The origins of syphilis are debated by historians with two prevailing theories. The first, known as the Columbian theory, suggests that Christopher Columbus's crew brought the disease back to Europe in 1493. The second, the pre-Columbian theory, hints that the ancient Greeks may have discovered treatments for some syphilis symptoms, though the evidence supporting this is sparse and inconclusive. Despite the uncertainty, the disease's devastating effects are well documented. The first major European outbreak occurred in 1806 when French troops surrounded Naples. Syphilis was notorious for its horrifying symptoms, which could cause flesh to rot and fall from the body, leading to grotesque disfigurement. Victims often suffered from excruciating pain, and their decaying appearance earned them the chilling moniker of syphilitic zombies. The imagery of people walking the streets with disintegrating body parts trailing behind them is disturbingly reminiscent of the zombies depicted in modern horror films. Though the disease wreaked havoc on the general population, wealthier individuals fared better, as they could afford early forms of treatment. Some even survived long enough to benefit from the early innovations in plastic surgery, allowing them to live relatively normal lives. While the story of syphilis is undeniably creepy, it also highlights the resilience and resourcefulness of those who sought to overcome its disfiguring effects. Number 5. Minnie Dean. In the late 19th century, the quiet town of Invercargill, New Zealand, became the setting for a disturbing series of events involving Minnie Dean, a woman known as a baby farmer. This term referred to foster parents who took in infants for a fee. By 1890, the local authorities grew suspicious of Minnie, noting the unusually large number of babies she cared for, along with her advertisements seeking even more. The police became especially concerned when they learned she was attempting to obtain life insurance for the children. While not uncommon, this action raised eyebrows given the unsettling circumstances surrounding her. Rumors began circulating about the fate of the infants, as several mysteriously vanished. Minnie's home was in disrepair, and troubling incidents occurred. In 1889, a 6-month-old infant in her care was lost, followed by a 6-week-old 2 years later. These events prompted authorities to keep a closer watch on her. In May 1895, their suspicions were confirmed when a reporter spotted Minnie boarding a train with a baby and a hat box. When she returned, the baby was gone, but the hat box appeared heavier than before. Minnie's explanation was that the baby had passed unexpectedly during the night, and, in her distress, she placed the child inside the hat box and calmly left the train station. This peculiar event led the reporter to notify the police, sparking an investigation. The authorities eventually discovered the baby from the train buried in Minnie's garden, along with the remains of 2 other children. This discovery sealed her fate. Minnie Dean was arrested, put on trial, and ultimately found responsible for her actions. On August 12, 1895, she faced the consequences, becoming the only woman in New Zealand's history to be executed, marking the end of one of the country's darkest and most unsettling stories. Number 4. Cruentation. In medieval times, a unique method known as cruentation was used to determine if someone was guilty of murder. It was believed that when a murderer approached the victim's body, the corpse would spontaneously bleed. In more complicated cases, the accused would undergo a trial by ordeal to establish their guilt or innocence. During this trial, the suspect would be made to place their hands on the deceased. If any of the wounds on the body began to bleed again, or if something unusual occurred, it was considered a sign that the accused was guilty of the murder. This was seen as a divine judgment, judicium Dei, confirming their involvement in the victim's untimely demise. Ironically, cruentation was surprisingly effective, likely due to the intense psychological pressure it placed on the accused. Facing the deceased and physically touching it while being observed often overwhelmed the culprit with guilt. The emotional distress from confronting the reality of their actions and the gruesome scene frequently led suspects to confess to the murder, revealing their guilt under the immense weight of their conscience. Number 3. Morbid Photography. In post-mortem photography, the images can be both disturbing and poignant, capturing entire families posed with the bodies of their deceased loved ones and babies who seem to be simply sleeping. In other instances, girls suffering from consumption are depicted with an air of regal calm, their lives tragically cut short by the disease, which adds a haunting allure to their final portraits. During the Victorian era, the concept of mortality was an omnipresent reality. Epidemics such as cholera, typhus, and diphtheria had left a significant mark on society, and in 1861, Queen Victoria's public mourning turned grief into a fashion trend. At this time, photography was still in its early stages. Capturing an image required a lengthy process, with slow shutter speeds and long exposure times, making living subjects appear blurred, often with faces obscured. However, the deceased, unable to move, were captured in sharp focus. In a rather eerie practice, mourners would paint eyes onto the bodies of the deceased to make them appear more lifelike in photographs. This unsettling detail added a disturbing layer to the final portraits. Additionally, it was common for people to keep locks of the deceased's hair in rings or lockets, and death masks were made from wax. Artists also produced numerous works featuring symbols and scenes related to mortality. As epidemics persisted, the demand for post-mortem photography grew, providing a tangible link to loved ones who had passed away. With Victorian children frequently falling victim to fatal illnesses such as scarlet fever, diphtheria, measles, and rubella, death photographers had a steady stream of work. The specter of mortality was ever present, and the Grim Reaper seemed to be taking a grim selfie, ever watchful and smiling through the lens of history. Number 2. Mummy Unwrapping Party. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Europeans were completely captivated by ancient Egypt, the concept of the afterlife, and all things related to mummies. This fascination, so intense it earned a name, Egyptomania, swept through Europe. influencing various aspects of culture and society. The intrigue with mummies dates back to the 15th century, when merchants began exporting them from Egypt to Europe, often for morbid purposes. One notable example was the use of mummies in medicine, with products like mumia, made from ground-up mummies. Another example was mummy brown, a paint color derived from ground mummy remains. These practices highlight the dark side of the era's fascination with ancient relics. By the 19th century, the allure of mummies peaked, partly due to the excitement following Napoleon's Egyptian and Syrian campaigns. This surge in interest led to the popularization of mummy unwrapping parties. These gatherings were not just scientific events, but social spectacles. Invitations were sent, and guests would come together to eat, drink, and watch the unwrapping of a mummy. Ironically, it was the distinguished English surgeon Thomas Pettigrew who popularized these unwrapping parties. While earlier unwrappings had occurred, they were far less frequent. At these Victorian events, the process began with a lecture or speech about the mummy's history. This was followed by the meticulous unrolling of layers of ancient cloth and the examination of burial artifacts, culminating in a discussion about the state of preservation and the appearance of the body. Such gatherings were both eerie and fascinating, reflecting the era's unique blend of scientific curiosity and macabre entertainment. And lastly, coming in at number 1. Gibbeting. Throughout history, convicted criminals have faced some of the most brutal and gruesome punishments imaginable, often far exceeding the severity of their crimes. Even in modern times, some places still impose harsh penalties, such as amputating a hand for theft. Among the most horrific of historical punishments was the infamous gibbet, a truly nightmarish device that transformed incarceration into a grisly spectacle. The practice of gibbeting involved placing criminals into a wooden cage shaped like a human, and then hanging it in a public place for all to see. While most criminals were executed before being gibbeted, some unfortunate individuals were subjected to this torment while still alive. Once trapped inside, the person could not move and was left to perish slowly, often from thirst if they were fortunate, as starvation was a much slower process that could drag on for weeks. Interestingly, only men were typically subjected to gibbeting, as the remains of women were highly valued by surgeons for dissection and study. The grim practice drew massive crowds, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, eager to witness the macabre display. For those living near a gibbet, the experience was far from enjoyable. On a sweltering 90-degree day in mid-August, the stench from the decaying individual would force residents to shut their windows and cook indoors. The ghastly scene was amplified by the constant clinking and clanking of the cage, the creaking and groaning of the wooden structure, and the unsettling sight of maggots and rotting flesh falling onto the street below. The gibbets, which could remain in place for years, were often placed on towering poles, sometimes as high as 30 feet, and even equipped with thousands of nails to prevent tampering. These measures ensured that the gibbeting served as a lasting and horrifying reminder of the consequences of crime. In terms of sheer creepiness, gibbeting stands as one of the most chilling punishments ever devised.